Because this flag represents everyone's freedom, including yours to disagree with me. He handed her a small envelope. This was found in Marcus's effects after he died. Inside was a faded photograph of a much younger Margaret Winters in a Red Cross uniform, tending to wounded soldiers during Desert Storm. On the back was written, "The angel who kept me alive long enough to make it home." Margaret's hand trembled. How did he? Marcus never forgot a face. He recognized you when he moved here last year, but you didn't remember him. He said you were too busy writing him up for his trash cans. James's voice softened. He used to say that sometimes the people who need the most rules are the ones carrying the heaviest memories. The flag-raising ceremony began with an unexpected addition. Standing beside James, wearing a dusty Red Cross pin she hadn't displayed in decades, Margaret Winters helped raise the flag to half-staff in honor of Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera and all those who never came home. 3 months later, a flagpole variance was quietly added to the HOA covenant, drafted by the newly elected HOA president, Margaret Winters herself, who now began each meeting with a moment of silence for fallen service members. And if neighbors noticed that her own yard now featured a small memorial garden with a flagpole of its own, they were wise enough not to mention it. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. The day after the ceremony, Margaret retreated to her house, blinds drawn, calls unanswered. Rumors circulated through Oakwood Heights. She was moving, suing, having a breakdown. In truth, she was unpacking boxes she hadn't opened in 28 years. Desert Storm medals and commendations, letters from soldiers she treated, her Red Cross uniform, still stained with sand and blood, and journals, dozens of them, filled with the names and faces she tried desperately to forget. James found her on his doorstep a week later, clutching a battered photo album. "I remembered him," she said without preamble. Staff Sergeant Rivera. Shrapnel wounds to the abdomen and chest. He was conscious the whole time, asking about his unit. "I stayed with him through 3 surgeries." James invited her in, over coffee that turned cold as the hours passed. Margaret shared the story she'd buried for decades, how she'd volunteered fresh out of law school, believing she could make a difference. How she treated hundreds of wounded soldiers, many who died despite her best efforts. How she'd returned home and built walls of rules and routine to keep the chaos at bay. "Control was all I had," she admitted. "When I couldn't save them, at least I could control something." The healing that began that day rippled outward. To the surprise of everyone, Margaret channeled her formidable organizational skills and legal knowledge into revitalizing the VFW post, where James and Mr. Abernathy were members. She established a scholarship fund in Marcus's name for children of fallen service members. When the national media called 6 months later for a follow-up story, they found a transformed Oakwood Heights. The HOA still had rules. Margaret insisted some structure was necessary, but they were applied with compassion and common sense. American flags flew from porches and yards. Mrs. Pattle's Diwali lights sparkled without complaint. The Rodriguez family's basketball hoops stayed up year-round. On the anniversary of Marcus's death, residents gathered again around James's flagpole, not in protest this time, but in remembrance. Margaret stood beside James as they lowered the flag to half-staff, her hand steady on the rope, her Red Cross pin gleaming in the morning sun. "You know what Marcus would say about all this?" James asked quietly. Margaret smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "That rules and freedom aren't opposites. They're partners." "Exactly," James nodded. "Freedom isn't free, but sometimes its cost isn't just paid on the battlefield." As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the lawn, the flag caught the breeze. James and Margaret stood in silence, watching it wave, a symbol not just of a nation, but of a community that had found its way home. Retired Army Sergeant James Wilson jolted awake at 5 a.m., the same way he had for 23 years of military service. Today wasn't just any Memorial Day. It marked exactly 1 year since he'd lost his best friend, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera, in their final deployment. James limped to his garage, his legs still bearing the shrapnel scars from the same explosion that took Marcus. The 20-foot flagpole had been delivered yesterday. As dawn broke over Oakwood Heights, James dug the foundation with methodical precision, mixing concrete and setting the base with the same care he'd once used disarming HOAs. By mid-morning, the pole stood tall, and with trembling hands, James unfurled the flag Marcus's family had given him, the same one that had draped his friend's casket. As the flag caught the breeze for the first time, an expensive SUV screeched to a halt in front of his house. Margaret Winters, a former corporate attorney who retired early to terrorize the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association, marched up his walkway, designer heels stabbing his lawn with each step. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, not bothering with introductions. Her cold eyes surveyed the flagpole as if it were a missile launcher. The HOA aesthetic guidelines explicitly prohibit permanent structures in front yards. James stood at attention, unconsciously assuming the military bearing ingrained in him. "Ma'am, I'm exercising my right as an American to display the flag. There's federal law protecting." "I don't care about your federal law." Margaret cut him off, making air quotes. "I care about property values and the covenant you signed." She snapped a series of photos with her phone. "That's a $150 fine for unauthorized installation, with an additional $50 daily until it's removed. Consider yourself lucky I'm not charging for the ISO factor." As she strutted back to her SUV, James noticed her bumper sticker, "If you don't like the rules, move." He looked up at Marcus's flag, now flying at full staff, and whispered, "Not a chance in hell, brother." James watched Margaret's SUV disappear around the corner, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts. This wasn't the first time they'd crossed paths. 3 months ago, when he'd first moved into Oakwood Heights seeking peace after his medical discharge, Margaret had welcomed him with a 3-page list of HOA violations for the moving boxes left in his driveway overnight. He limped back inside, his leg throbbing, a barometer for his rising blood pressure. The modest ranch house had been a stretch for his military pension, but worth every penny for the quiet cul-de-sac and the oak tree in the backyard that reminded him of the one he'd climbed as a boy in rural Ohio. Now this sanctuary felt like another battlefield. His phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. "Violation notice has been emailed. Clock is ticking." James tossed the phone onto the couch and opened his laptop. The email contained an attachment titled, "Urgent violation. Immediate attention required," with a high-priority flag. The document was 8 pages long, citing 17 different sections of the HOA covenant. The final page required his signature, acknowledging the violation and agreeing to remove the flagpole within 48 hours. "Unbelievable," he muttered, scrolling through the legalese. The coffee in his army-strong mug had gone cold. His doorbell rang. James opened it to find his neighbor, old Mr. Abernathy, a Korean War veteran who walked with 2 canes and wore his VFW cap everywhere. "Saw that Winters woman taking pictures," Mr. Abernathy said without preamble. "She giving you trouble about the flag?" James nodded, stepping aside to let the older man in. "Seems I've violated the sacred HOA covenant." Mr. Abernathy snorted. "She tried that with me when I put up my flagpole 5 years ago. Got my grandson, he's a lawyer up in Chicago, to write her a letter citing the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act. Never heard another peep." Hope flickered in James's chest. "You have a copy of that letter?" "Better." Mr. Abernathy pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I keep copies in my wallet for just such occasions. Never know when another veteran might need ammunition against the likes of Margaret Winters." James unfolded the letter. It was concise, professional, and cited 3 specific federal laws protecting homeowners' rights to display the American flag, along with relevant case precedents. "This is..." "Thank you, sir." Mr. Abernathy waved away the thanks. "Margaret's husband left her 3 years ago. Since then, she's been on a mission to control everything and everyone in this neighborhood. Last month, she tried to find the Ramirez family for their son's basketball hoop. Month before that, it was Mrs. Chen's wind chimes." James's phone buzzed again. Another email from Margaret. "A detailed violation. Improper flag PROTOCOO. Failure to illuminate flag during nighttime display. The doorbell rang at 7 a.m. the next day. James opened it to find 12-year-old Zach from next door holding up his phone. "Mr. Wilson, you've gone viral." Sofia Rodriguez, Zach's mother and a former war correspondent turned local journalist, had photographed Margaret issuing the fine. Her social media post included James's military history, Marcus's story, and the exact wording of the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005. The post had 15,000 shares and counting. "Mom says Margaret's a paper tiger," Zach explained, using air quotes around the unfamiliar phrase. "She's done this before. Last year she tried to find Mrs. Patel for her Diwali lights." By noon, James's quiet street had transformed. Michael Chen closed his community coffee shop early to set up a refreshment stand on James's lawn. On the house, he insisted, handing James an espresso. "My father escaped communist China, where flying the wrong flag could get you killed. This matters." Veterans arrived in waves, some in uniform, others bearing the unmistakable bearing of military service. A motorcycle club of Vietnam vets formed an honor guard around the flagpole. 3 Afghanistan veterans who'd served in James's unit made a 6-hour drive after seeing the post. Margaret's response came swiftly. She parked across the street in her SUV, documenting everything with a telephoto lens. When that didn't dissuade the gathering, she deployed her nuclear option, the HOA violation sticker brigade. 6 of her loyal committee members began placing fluorescent orange violation stickers on every car parked on the street. The atmosphere shifted when they placed a sticker on a wheelchair-accessible van belonging to a 93-year-old World War II veteran. The old man's caregiver confronted them, filming the entire exchange on her phone. "Shame!" someone shouted, and the word spread through the crowd until the HOA committee retreated under a chorus of disapproval. As twilight fell, someone brought out guitars. The impromptu gathering became an unplanned vigil, with James sharing stories of Marcus by the light of dozens of phone flashlights held aloft. James hadn't expected any of this. After Sophia's son left that morning, he'd spent an hour drafting a careful response to Margaret's violation notice. Citing Mr. Abernathy's legal letter, he'd barely hit send when his phone started ringing. First, it was local veterans he knew from the VFW. Then came calls from numbers he didn't recognize, veterans who'd seen Sophia's post and wanted to know how they could help. By mid-afternoon, the gathering had spilled onto 3 neighboring lawns. Mrs. Patel emerged from her house with trays of homemade samosas. "Margaret tried to find me for my Diwali lights," she explained, her voice soft, but her eyes fierce. "My husband and I came to America for freedom. We light our lights, you fly your flag." The Rodriguez family strung fairy lights between trees. The Chen family brought lanterns. 3 houses down, the Kim family, who rarely participated in neighborhood events, set up tables with Korean barbecue. Mr. Kim, a typically reserved accountant, approached James with a firm handshake. "My grandfather fought alongside Americans in the Korean War," he said. "He always told us to remember who stood with us when it mattered." James watched in amazement as the neighborhood he'd barely gotten to know transformed into a unified front. Children darted between adults, veterans swapped stories with civilians, and somewhere in the mix, James realized he was smiling for the first time in months. Then came the second wave of Margaret's counterattack. A police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing but siren silent. Officer Dave Morales, a young cop with regulation-perfect posture, approached with obvious discomfort. "We've received noise complaints," he said, not quite meeting James's eyes, "and reports of parking violations." Before James could respond, Sophia stepped forward, phone recording. "Officer Morales, are you aware this gathering is protected under First Amendment rights to peaceful assembly, and that these veterans are exercising their federally protected right to display the American flag?" Officer Morales shifted his weight. "Ma'am, I'm just responding to..." "Dave," a booming voice cut through the crowd. Chief Carlos Vasquez, Oakwood's police chief for 20 years, emerged with a plate of Mrs. Patel's samosas. "I thought I recognized the unit number. Stand down, son." The young officer looked confused. Sir? Chief Vasquez clapped him on the shoulder. I'm off duty and attending a perfectly legal community gathering. Why don't you join us? Mrs. Kim's bulgogi is exceptional. As Officer Morales hesitantly accepted a plate, James caught sight of Margaret across the street, furiously typing on her phone. Whatever ammunition she had left, he suspected she was about to use it all. Incoming, Mr. Abernathy murmured, nudging James. 3 o'clock. A black Lincoln Town car with tinted windows purred down the street, stopping directly in front of James's house. The back door opened, and a tall man in an expensive suit emerged, surveying the scene with clinical detachment. That's Jonathan Pierce, Sophia whispered to James. Margaret's former law partner. If she's called him, she's desperate. The attorney approached James with a manila envelope. Mr. Wilson, he said with practiced neutrality, I represent the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association. This is a cease and desist order. Mayor Eleanor Jackson was in the middle of budget negotiations when her phone exploded with notifications. The video of Margaret's committee stickering the World War II veterans van had reached over 1 million views overnight. Hashtags like #FlagFight and #HOA Karen were trending nationally. God help me, she muttered, grabbing her coat. Tell the city attorney to meet me at the car. Eleanor wasn't just Oakwood's first female mayor. She was a retired Air Force colonel whose father had earned a Purple Heart in Vietnam. She'd been fighting with Margaret Winters since the HOA tried to block a halfway house for homeless veterans on the edge of Oakwood Heights. Meanwhile, Margaret had barricaded herself in the HOA community center, surrounded by binders of regulations and 3 loyalists who shared her vision of a perfectly controlled neighborhood. She was drafting an emergency injunction when the door burst open. This has gone far enough, Margaret, said Frederick Thompson, the HOA's treasurer and longest-serving board member. I've called an emergency board meeting. The boardroom filled quickly. Margaret had prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled Maintaining Standards in the Face of Mob Rule, but never got to slide 2. The board has received legal counsel. Frederick announced that our covenant cannot supersede federal law. Furthermore, our insurance carrier has informed us that continuing this fight could constitute acting in bad faith, potentially voiding our liability coverage. This is nothing but surrender. Margaret slammed her hand on the table. If we back down on flagpoles, next it'll be lawn gnomes and inflatable Santas. The door opened again, and Mayor Jackson entered with the city attorney and the news cameras Margaret had been dodging all day. Actually, said the mayor, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to commanding rooms much larger than this, I think we need to discuss the city ordinance protecting veterans' rights that the council passed 20 minutes ago. Unanimously, I might add. Margaret's face flushed crimson. This is a private meeting of a private organization. You have no jurisdiction here, Eleanor. Mayor Jackson smiled thinly. That's Mayor Jackson to you, Margaret, and you'd be surprised at the jurisdiction I have when a homeowners association potentially violates federal law within my city limits. The city attorney, Diane Chen, Michael Chen's sister, Margaret realized with dawning horror, stepped forward and placed a thick folder on the table. The city council has authorized me to investigate whether the Oakwood Heights HOA has engaged in a pattern of discriminatory enforcement against veterans, religious minorities, and families with children. She opened the folder, revealing dozens of documented complaints. Mrs. Patel's Darwolly lights, the Rodriguez family's basketball hoop, Mr. Abernathy's flagpole from 5 years ago, the Kim family's request to install a small memorial stone for their son who died in Iraq. Margaret stiffened. Those were all legitimate violations of our covenant. Perhaps, Diane replied, removing her glasses. But when we see selective enforcement against certain groups while ignoring similar violations by others, it raises serious concerns under the Fair Housing Act. Frederick cleared his throat. What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Chen? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. The Department of Housing and Urban Development takes discriminatory HOA practices very seriously. Fines can reach $16,000 per violation, plus damages. A hush fell over the room. Board member Helen Wu, who had faithfully supported Margaret for years, spoke up. How many violations are we potentially talking about? Diane flipped through her folder. Our preliminary investigation has identified 47 potential instances of discriminatory enforcement over the past 18 months. The color drained from Margaret's face as she did the mental calculation. That's over $700,000 in potential fines alone. Mayor Jackson finished for her before we even discussed damages or legal fees. Margaret's attorney, Jonathan Pierce, who had been silently observing from the corner, closed his notebook. If you'll excuse me, I need to make a call to the HOA's insurance provider. Pierce, where are you going? Margaret demanded as he headed for the door. To determine if our policy covers willful violations of federal law, he replied coolly. Preliminary answer, it doesn't. The boardroom erupted into chaotic crosstalk. Board members huddled in corners, whispering frantically. Margaret stood alone at the head of the table, her PowerPoint still projecting its title slide onto the wall behind her. Mayor Jackson approached her quietly. You know, Margaret, this could all go away. One public apology, a revision of your covenant to explicitly protect veterans' rights, and of course, immediate cancellation of all fines against Sergeant Wilson. Why are you doing this? Margaret hissed. This is about more than a flag. Eleanor's professional smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened. You're right. It's about a community. It's about respecting the people who sacrificed everything for the freedoms you exploit. And personally, she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. It's about that halfway house for homeless veterans you tried to block. The one where my brother, who served 3 tours in Afghanistan and came home with PTSD, finally found a place to heal. Before Margaret could respond, Frederick called the meeting back to order. I move that we immediately rescind all fines against Sergeant Wilson and issue a formal apology. Helen Wu quickly seconded the motion. As the vote commenced, Margaret watched her carefully constructed kingdom crumble. Board members who had rubber-stamped her decisions for years now avoided her gaze as they raised their hands in favor of the motion. The motion passes 6-1, Frederick announced, not bothering to ask for Margaret's vote. The HOA boardroom fell silent as Mayor Jackson placed a document on the table. This emergency ordinance establishes that any HOA regulation in conflict with veterans' federally protected rights is null and void within city limits. She slid the paper toward Margaret. Additionally, any fines issued under such invalid regulations must be immediately rescinded, with the HOA bearing responsibility for legal fees, should this require court intervention. Frederick Thompson stood up. As treasurer, I move that all fines against Sergeant Wilson be immediately vacated and that we issue a formal apology. The vote was 6-1. Margaret's face flushed crimson as she cast the lone dissenting vote. As cameras flashed, Mayor Jackson handed Frederick a city proclamation establishing an annual Veterans Appreciation Day, to be inaugurated with a flag-raising ceremony at James Wilson's home the following Saturday. Margaret stormed out, nearly colliding with James, who had been waiting outside. This isn't over, she hissed. James simply nodded. You're right, it isn't.